In this video, we will be discussing the second necessary condition in the traditional analysis of the concept of lying, known as the untruthfulness condition. And remember that the untruthfulness condition says that a requirement for lying is that the liar believe that what he or she is saying is false or untrue. So let's start with a pair of distinctions here, one of which you're probably, or you should be familiar with at this point in the course, and the other which probably be new for you. So the first distinction here between a proposition that's true versus a proposition that's untrue, this is something that we've talked about extensively already in the class. So remember that according to the correspondence theory of truth, to say that a proposition is true is just to say that it corresponds to reality. It matches reality. And to say that a proposition is untrue or false is to say that that proposition doesn't match reality or it doesn't correspond to reality. So again, this is a distinction that you should already be comfortable with and familiar with. The second one's a new one. And it's very important that you get comfortable and familiar with this terminology, because the philosophers who write about this particular issue in the literature on lying use this distinction. They use this terminology all the time. And if you're not able to distinguish truthful and untruthful from true and untrue, you're going to get very confused very quickly. So it's important to kind of take a moment and make sure that you clearly understand this distinction. So to say that a proposition is truthful is simply to say that the person who's asserting that proposition believes that it's true. And to say that a proposition is untruthful is just to say that the person that's asserting that proposition believes that it's false. So the difference between these two distinctions is that true and untrue have to do with whether or not the proposition corresponds to reality, which has nothing to do with what the person believes that's asserting the proposition. Whereas the bottom one, truthful and untruthful, has everything to do with what the person believes who's asserting the proposition. And it has nothing to do with whether or not the proposition corresponds to reality. So if the proposition corresponds to reality, it's true. If that proposition is believed to be true by the person asserting it, then it's truthful. If the proposition doesn't correspond to reality, then it's untrue or false. If the person that's asserting the proposition believes that it's false, then we say that it's untruthful. So just to help cement these distinctions in your mind, let's consider 4 completely different scenarios about Bob and his assertions and his beliefs and what that implies about the status of the proposition that he's asserting. So start with the top option here. Let's say Bob believes that 1 + 1 = 2, which is what he should believe. And let's assume that Bob asserts that 1 + 1 = 2. So the top option is by far the most common that we would encounter. Most people believe that 1 + 1 = 2, and most people would assert that 1 + 1 = 2. So if Bob does this, what's the status of the asserted proposition? The asserted proposition is this one, right? It's the one he's asserting to be true. Well, it's both true and truthful. So this asserted proposition is true, right? Because it corresponds to reality. 1 + 1 is actually 2. It's truthful because this assertion, this proposition that he's asserting, is something that he actually believes is true. So to figure out whether it's true, we just need to look at the proposition and ask ourselves, does it correspond to reality? To determine whether the proposition is truthful, we have to see whether or not what he's asserting matches his belief. Right? Okay, second line. Let's say Bob believes that 1 + 1 = 2, which again is what he should believe, but he asserts that 1 + 1 = 7. So maybe he's lying, for example, right? So here, notice the status changes, both the status in both regards changes. So the proposition he asserts 1 and 1 is 7 is untrue. Why? Because 1 and 1 is 2, right? The proposition that 1 and 1 is 7 doesn't match reality, so it's untrue. The asserted proposition that 1 and 1 is 7 is untruthful because it doesn't match his belief, right? It's untruthful because when Bob asserts that 1 and 1 is 7, he believes that's false because he believes that 1 and 1 equals 2, right? So in this case, the proposition that he asserts would be both untruthful and untrue. Okay, the third line. So the bottom two examples are the kind of weird ones, but they're certainly possible. They could happen. So let's say Bob is really bad at math, and Bob believes that 1 and 1 is 7. So he really believes it. And you put him on a lie detector, put him on a polygraph, ask him, is 1 and 1 7? He says yes, and he passes, right? So he's not making anything up here. He really thinks 1 and 1 is 7. And he asserts that 1 and 1 is 7. All right, so he just asserts the very thing that he believes. So here, notice in this case, the asserted proposition that 1 and 1 is 7 is definitely untrue, right? Why is it untrue? Because 1 and 1 equals 7 doesn't match reality. It doesn't correspond to reality. 1 and 1 is actually 2. So what he's saying here is untrue. But notice that what he is saying is perfectly truthful. It's truthful because what he says, namely that 1 plus 1 equals 7, matches his belief, right? He's saying the very thing that he believes. So he's saying something that's truthful, even though it's untrue, it's false. Okay, last line. So here, let's assume that Bob believes that 1 and 1 is 7. So Bob is still very, very confused about math. He really thinks that 1 and 1 is 7, but he says, or he asserts that 1 and 1 equals 2. Well, in this strange case, notice that what he's saying, what he's asserting, namely that 1 plus 1 equals 2, is actually true. It corresponds to reality. 1 and 1 is 2. Nonetheless, even though what he's saying is true, what he is saying, the proposition he's asserting here, is untruthful because it doesn't match his belief, right? He thinks it's false that 1 plus 1 equals 2 because he thinks that 1 plus 1 equals 7. So since what he's asserting is the opposite of what he believes, it's untruthful, even though it's factually correct, even though it's true, okay? So if you ever have trouble sort of remembering the distinction, these two distinctions, perhaps going back to these examples will sort of help keep it clear in your mind. Okay, so let's go back to the untruthfulness condition. So the untruthfulness condition, as it's right in the name now, which should be clear to you, is that the liar, in order to be lying, must believe that what he or she is asserting is false. That is, another way of saying that would be, given our new terminology, the liar, in order to be lying, must assert an untruthful proposition, right? Must assert a proposition that he or she believes is false. So this is why it's called the untruthfulness condition and not the falsity condition, right? We don't call it the falsity condition because the condition is not that the proposition has to be false. The condition is that the person asserting the proposition, the liar, must believe that it's false. So that's why we call it the untruthfulness condition rather than the falsity condition. So let's try to illustrate and clarify this condition by looking at a series of examples like we did in the previous video with the first condition. So let's say we have a 3-year-old child, and this child says Santa is real. And so this kid really believes that Santa Claus exists, and the 3-year-old says Santa is real, asserts that Santa is real. There's no lie here. Even though Santa is not real, even though Santa doesn't exist. This child is not lying, since the child sincerely believes that Santa is real. So this is just a circumstance where the proposition being asserted by the child is untrue, right? It's false. There is no Santa Claus, right? But nonetheless, that proposition is truthful because the child believes that it's true. So since the requirement for lying is that the proposition be untruthful, but this child is asserting a truthful proposition, then this child is not lying. And this should sort of fit with your sort of common sense pre-theoretical understanding of lying. If a 3-year-old walks up to you and says Santa is real, you probably don't think the kid is lying, right? And so the kid is saying something that isn't true, but that doesn't mean he's lying or she is lying. Why? Because the kid believes that it's true, right? So you're only lying when you say the opposite of what you believe. And so this kid is just asserting what he or she believes. Therefore, there's no lie. It's not untruthful. Okay, let's amp up the complexity here a little bit. All of your friends are gathered in the kitchen, waiting to surprise you when you walk in. I believe there is cold beer in the fridge. So in order to trick you into going into the kitchen, I tell you that there is cold beer in the fridge because I know you want a beer. All right, I want to get you to walk into the surprise party. My deception works. You walk right into the party. But unbeknownst to me, there wasn't ever any beer in the fridge. So I was just confused. I was wrong. I thought there was beer in the fridge, but there wasn't. So oddly, this case has a lot of the things that people typically associate with lying. I've told you something that's completely false, right? I told you there was beer in the fridge and there wasn't. Further, I'm trying to deceive you, trying to trick you, trying to get you to walk into the kitchen when you ordinarily wouldn't have done so, right? So I'm telling you something that's untrue with the intent to try to deceive you. And that certainly on the surface kind of looks like a lie. So the question is this really a lie? Am I lying to you? And it's important to notice that according to the traditional analysis of the concept of lying, I'm not lying to you here. And the reason I'm not lying to you is because even though what I said wasn't true, even though what I said to you is untrue, right? It's not true, it's false. I believed it was true. I thought it was true. I thought there was beer in the fridge. So since I believed that what I asserted, that means that the assertion that I made, the proposition that I asserted was completely truthful, which means it's not a lie because lies have to be untruthful, right? So again, I think if you just sort of rely on your simple intuitions about a case like this, and you know, if you were in this situation and this happened, I don't think you'd be real mad at me. I don't think you'd say, why did you lie to me about there being beer in the fridge? All I would say is, I thought there was beer in the fridge, right? And as soon as I say, I thought there was beer in the fridge, that proves, according to this traditional analysis, that I wasn't actually lying because I was just saying to you what I thought was true all along. Okay, totally different kind of example involving Fred and Chris. So Fred and Chris are roommates. Fred just checked the weather forecast on his phone and sees that the forecast predicts no rain for the day. So what that means then is that Fred thinks it's not going to rain, right? But in order to prank Chris, Fred tells him it's going to rain today. So Chris grabs his umbrella and walks out of the door to go to class. So he's deceiving him. He's tricking him, right? He wants him to think it's going to rain so that he needlessly carries around his umbrella all day with him. It's like a prank. Now, as it turns out, the forecast was wrong, and it rains all day. So, in this case, what Fred said to Chris when he said it's going to rain today was actually completely true. He asserted to Chris that it's going to rain today, and it rained all day long. He actually did need the umbrella, so unbeknownst to him, he was actually helping his roommate by getting him to bring the umbrella. The question is this a lie? And again, on the surface here, it might seem like this can't be a lie because what Fred is telling to Chris was actually true. He said it's going to rain, and it rained. But notice that according to the traditional analysis here of the concept of lying, this is a lie, even though what he said to Chris was completely 100% true. It was a true proposition. He's lying to him. And the reason he's lying to him is because it's an untruthful proposition, even though it's true. When he said it's going to rain today, that's true. It was going to rain today, but it was untruthful. Why? Because he believed it was false, right? So if you think about our 4 conditions here, every single one of the 4 conditions is met in this case, which guarantees, according to the traditional analysis, that you've got a lie on your hands. So first condition, right? Fred has to assert that it's going to rain today, and he does. Second condition, the one that we're talking about here, that proposition has to be untruthful. Fred has to believe that what he is saying to Chris is false, and that's correct. He does believe that it's false. He thinks it's not going to rain today because he read the weather forecast, right? So he's saying the opposite of what he believes, so the proposition is untruthful. He clearly addresses Chris when he says it to him, so the third condition is met, and he's certainly trying to deceive Chris by getting him to believe the opposite of what Fred thinks is true. Fred thinks that it's not going to rain, so he asserts that it is in an attempt to get Chris to believe the opposite of what Fred actually thinks. So it's a lie through and through. It meets every single one of the conditions. So again, the point of this example is to illustrate that there are plenty of lies that end up being true, that something isn't required to be false in order to be a lie. An assertion doesn't have to be untrue or false. It has to be untruthful in order for it to count as a lie, in order to meet this condition. Okay, 2 more examples here. And these types of examples are critically important for some things that we're going to do later in the class. So we're going to talk much, much more extensively about examples of the type that these last 2 fall into. But for our purposes now, we're just going to mention them briefly in order to again, illustrate the untruthfulness condition and to illustrate these sort of cases that might look on the surface like a lie, but according to the traditional analysis, they're actually not. So Tony is married to Lisa, but he has started having an affair with a colleague at work. Let's call her Nina. Lisa is getting suspicious and asks him, "Did you have lunch with Nina today?" And Tony replies, I'll pay very careful attention to the words here. He says, "I had lunch in my office today, dear." Now, Tony did have lunch in his office, but he had it with Nina. So Tony's having this affair with Nina, this woman he knows from work. And they secretly go into his office during lunch hour and eat lunch together. Right? His wife is suspicious that he's having an affair, so she confronts him on this. She says, "Did you have lunch with Nina today?" And then what he says to her is perfectly true, right? He says, "I had lunch in my office today, dear," which is 100% true. He really did have lunch in his office. But he's definitely trying to deceive her. He's trying to trick her. So the question is he lying to Lisa? And the answer here is that he's not lying according to the traditional analysis of lying, of the concept of lying. And the reason he's not lying to her is because, again, a requirement for lying is that what you say has to be untruthful. You have to believe that what you're saying is false. What does Tony say to her? He says, "I had lunch in my office today." Does he believe that's false? No, he believes it's true, right? He did have lunch in his office, and he believes that he had lunch in his office. So what he's saying to her is completely truthful and true, right? It's true and truthful. It corresponds to reality, and he believes that it's true. So since what he's saying to her is truthful, but the requirement for lying is that it be untruthful, he's not lying because he doesn't meet that condition, right? He asserted that he had lunch in his office, and he believes that's true. So the liar, in order to be lying, has to believe that what he or she says is false. Tony doesn't believe that what he says is false. He believes that what he said is true, so therefore he's not lying. Critically important to understand, though, in this case, no one's saying, I mean, when we say that he's not lying here, or when the traditional analysis implies that he's not lying, we're not saying that Tony hasn't done anything wrong. And we're not saying that Tony hasn't deceived his wife. We're not saying that Tony isn't doing something immoral here in some sense by deceiving his wife in this kind of way. But all we're doing is we're making the technical point that even though he's deceiving her clearly, that deception doesn't count as a lie. So there's lots of forms of deception that people can engage in. Some are lies and some are not. So all lies involve deception, but not all deception takes the form of a lie. So this is just one of those instances where Tony is deceiving his wife for sure, but what he's doing technically doesn't count as a lie because he believes what he's saying. Also notice just very quickly here, in case you're not quite following the dynamic in the conversation, when he says, "I had lunch in my office today, dear," the idea is that when he says that, even though what he's saying is technically true, he knows what Lisa is going to infer from that. So when he says, "I had lunch in my office today, dear," with a certain, body language and intonation when he says it, what that clearly conveys to her is that he had lunch by himself in his office, which is what he wants to convey to her, right? So what he's conveying to her is surely untruthful. But this requirement for lying says that you're only lying when what you assert is actually untruthful. And what he asserts is that he had lunch in his office, and that's not untruthful. It's completely truthful. So again, what's going on here is that he's basically using the truth, right, which is that he had lunch in his office, to deceive her. But since lying involves using what is untruthful to deceive, this doesn't count as a lie. So another example that illustrates the exact same thing, consider this case. So Fiona is terrified of flying. Her sister, Helen, is planning a trip for the two of them to a remote cabin in the Canadian Rockies, a trip that requires a 45-minute helicopter flight into the wilderness. Fiona asks her sister, "We aren't going to have to fly anywhere in this trip, are we?" She's nervous because she has this phobia. So again, pay attention carefully to how Helen responds. She says, "I promise you, sis, we won't step foot on a plane the entire trip." All right, so Helen's being real sneaky here, just like Tony was. Helen is using the truth. When she says, "We won't step on foot on a plane the entire trip," she's telling the truth. There's no plans for them to get on a plane ever the entire time on the trip. But she knows that given the question that Fiona asked, which is, "We aren't going to have to fly anywhere on this trip, are we?" that when Helen responds to her and says, "We won't step foot on a plane," she knows that Helen is going to infer from that what she means is that they're not going to fly at all. And that's how the deception works, right? Helen actually speaks the truth. She says something that's truthful, that she believes is true, but her intent is to deceive her sister, right? So what Helen says is true. We won't step foot on a plane the entire trip. Helicopters are not airplanes, right? They're two different types of machines. And so therefore what Helen says is strictly speaking true, but she's definitely using it to deceive her sister into inferring and then believing something that is actually untruthful. So is she lying? Well, no, she's not lying for the same reason that Tony's not lying. What did she assert? She asserted that they wouldn't be on a plane. Is that truthful? Yeah, Helen believes that's true. She believes they're not going to get on a plane. She knows very well they're never going to get on a plane. They're going to get on a helicopter. And so since Helen believes what she is asserting, Helen isn't lying to her sister when she asserts it, even though she is clearly deceiving her by trying to get her to believe this other thing that is sort of implied by what she's saying that she doesn't think is true, right? So again, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we're going to talk about these cases much, much more extensively a bit later on in the class. We're going to come back to these cases. We're going to analyze them more carefully and try to figure out exactly sort of what's happening and how the deception works when we talk about them later in the course. But for our purposes right now, just sort of note that according to the traditional analysis of the concept of lying, neither the Tony case nor the Fiona case counts as an instance of lying, simply because Tony believes what he has asserted and Fiona believes what she has asserted, so they can't be lying. Just quick terminology here. These types of cases, the case of Tony and Fiona, these are in the literature on this. When you read what philosophers have to say about these kinds of cases, they use two different terms to refer to them. The most common is misleading. So they'll say that Tony was misleading Lisa. He wasn't lying to her. He was misleading her without lying to her. And they would say that Helen is misleading Fiona. Helen isn't lying to Fiona. She's misleading her without lying to her. That's the term that would be used here to describe what they're doing. It's also called paltering. This is kind of a technical term. You don't see it used that often, but occasionally you run into it. So if you see a philosopher within the context of this kind of discussion talking about misleading or paltering, they're talking about these cases that don't involve lying, even though they involve deception, like the Tony case and the Helen case.